In this video, we'll be talking about pedigrees, what they are, what they're used for, and how to read them. So first, let's talk about what a pedigree is. And really, all a pedigree is just a family tree. And when you look at the family tree, you're going to be specifically looking at whatever particular trait or disorder is an interest. And the pedigree just shows all the generations of your family that has inherited that particular trait or disorder. So in order to be able to read a pedigree, you're going to need to understand the symbols. So the first symbol that we'll talk about is the female symbol. And the female symbol is always represented with a circle. The male symbol is always represented with a square. If two people have mated, then there's going to be a black line, like you see here, or any line, that's going to connect the male to the female. When they have offspring, there's going to be a bracket that comes down and will bracket over all the children. It's important to know that their offspring have to be connected to that bracket. So if they're not connected to that bracket, that could mean that you may have another couple over here, male and female, and then if let's just say the bracket goes like this, okay, then these two sets of children would be cousins. But unless they're under the same bracket, that means that they are brother and sister. So here we would have two females and one male. So that's two sisters and one brother. If a symbol, whether it's male or female, square or circle, if it's empty, that means that that person does not physically show the trait or condition or disorder, whatever you're looking at. So that means that, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's dominant. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's recessive. In order to determine that, you would have to look at the inheritance or the patterns, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. But depending on that particular pedigree, if the pedigree is a recessive pedigree, that means that the person who doesn't have a shade would be dominant. It's the opposite. It just means that their phenotype does not show the trait at all. If a symbol is filled completely, that means that they do show that trait or condition or disorder. So if it's a recessive inheritance, then they are automatically recessive. If it's a dominant inheritance, then they automatically, that they are dominant. Whether they are homozygous dominant or heterozygous, you'd have to figure that out by looking at the family members around them. But if that square or circle is filled in, then that means that they have the trait or condition. And last, if the circle or the square is half filled, that means that they are carriers. So they do not show the trait or condition, but they are able to pass on a copy to the next generation. And the way that the generations are labeled is by Roman numerals, and then the individuals themselves are used with regular Arabic numbers. So let's take a look at this pedigree. So as I said, the males are square and the females are circle. So this would be generation 1, represented over here with the Roman numeral. The way that you would address each individual, this square right here, this male, this would be individual 1, 1. Generation 1, individual 1, going from the left to the right. So this female over here, his wife, this is individual 1, 2. So that's Roman numeral 1 and Arabic number 2. Skipping to the second generation, so this is their children. Now if you take a look here, like I said before, only the individuals under the bracket are their children. This female over here is married into the family. So this female and this male had 1, 2, 3 sons and 1, 2 daughters, and they have 1 daughter-in-law. Okay, so then when we take a look at that, like if you were to name any individual, this would be individual 2, 1, 2, 2, 2, 3, 2, 4, 2, 5, 2, 6, even though they're not in under the bracket, they still are counted as an individual like that. Then this male and this female have 3 children, 1, 2, 3, 2 females and 1 male. Here is the married and male over here, and they have 1, 2, 3 children, 2 females and 1 male. So the way that you'd be able to take a look at, whatever trait this is, and they're not specifically saying what the trait is. There are there's really 4 different kinds of inheritances that we'll be looking at. We'll be looking at autosomal dominant. As we all know, autosomal means on the autosome, on chromosomes number 1 through 22, which do not get passed down. Well, they get passed down, but they're not on the sex chromosome themselves. So they do all get passed down, but they are not sex-linked. Sex-linked is only on the X chromosome. So autosomal dominant would mean that you can have an even number, complete 50-50 probability of males and females getting it. And you would see at least one fully shaded individual in each of these generations. And to me, it's not looking like we're seeing that because these are carriers up here. There's only one fully shaded person here, missing a generation here, and then fully shaded individuals down here. So what this tells me is that because it is an even, there are females here and a male here that's completely affected. This would tell me that this is an autosomal recessive trait. Recessive traits skip at least one generation. And again, carriers don't count because they don't fully show the trait. So you can either have autosomal dominant, and we'll go over this a little bit. I have a slide where it's written all down for you, but it might be easier to see it on here. So autosomal dominant is where you have at least one shaded person in each generation. It's 50-50 chance of males and females affected or showing the trait. Autosomal recessive is where it's same thing, 50-50 males and females can get it, but at least one generation is being skipped, which this is what I'm seeing here. This would be an autosomal recessive trait. So just using that as an example, once you realize and once you figure out the pattern of the pedigree, now you can look at the genotypes of all these individuals. You automatically know if this is an autosomal recessive trait, which we have now identified it as. Every single person, like this individual here, individual 2-4, individual 4-1, and individual 4-2, you know 100% that they have a recessive genotype because they are showing the trait. So then from there you can figure out what everyone else's genotypes are, because then you know that their parents are heterozygous, and you know that any carrier is going to be heterozygous, which then again only leaves the unshaded individuals to be homozygous dominant. So then that's how you're able to follow a particular trait or a particular disorder through the family. Now let's continue and talk more about different traits. So here we have sex-linked genes and traits, and as we've talked about, I know we talked about sex-linked and X-linked traits a lot already. Just to review that a little bit, they are only located on the X-axis, and because of that, males are more likely to get that particular trait. If a trait is autosomal, it's going to appear in both sexes equally. If it's sex-linked, it's mainly seen in males, but remember that females can get it. They just need to have 2 copies of the defective gene instead of males who only need 1. So females are most likely carriers if it's sex-linked. If it's autosomal, then it can appear in both males and females. Now here I've made a little key for you to look at the inheritance. So this is the first thing that you have to do when you look at a pedigree. You have to go, okay, what is the pattern? Here are your four choices. It's either going to be, like I said before, autosomal dominant, autosomal recessive, X-linked dominant, or X-linked recessive. Now, the big thing with the term autosomal, it means that it's going to be 50-50% chance that males and females can get it. Doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be exactly half males and exactly half females, but you'll be able to tell, what the majority males versus females, who's going to get that trait. For the X-linked, as we stated before, mostly males will get it. Now, looking at the difference between dominant and recessive, for both X-linked dominant and autosomal dominant, you will see at least one fully shaded individual in each generation. That's the main key. In order for it to be a dominant trait, it should be shown in every single generation. And if it's autosomal recessive or X-linked recessive, it's going to skip at least one generation. It can skip two, it can skip three, but in order for it to be considered recessive, it would have to at least skip one, and carriers don't count. Again, because carriers don't physically show the trait, so you would have to have fully shaded individual not showing up in at least one generation in order for it to be considered recessive. And even if you have a really large pedigree and you have one shaded individual in a particular generation, then that does not count as skipping it. Therefore, that person, they're going to attribute to it being dominant. So genetic disorders, obviously we talked about in class, they can be passed down through the somatic, not the somatic genes, the germ cell genes only. So in order for them to be passed down, they have to be passed down through the gametes, and there are tests out there. Amniocentesis is one of the examples of tests that can be done to help doctors test a fetus before they're born for any type of genetic disorder. Genetic counseling is offered for the parents of individuals that think that they might have offspring that would be, potential for any type of genetic disorder. And in terms of treating genetic diseases, every single disease is different and they're treated in completely different ways. But really, they just belong into two major categories. You're either going to be treated as a symptom relieving treatment, because again, there is no actual cure for genetic diseases because they are inherited and they're embedded in your DNA. So you're either going to have symptom relieving treatments or you're going to have symptom prevention treatments. Just using Lorenzo's oil as an example, any child that is born with ALD, they take Lorenzo's oil to prevent any of those symptoms from happening. Not all genetic diseases are so lucky to have something like that, so they would most likely fall into the symptom relieving treatment, which, whatever alleviates the symptoms of that particular disorder, that is the treatment that that particular individual would be put on. Okay. In gene therapy, which again, gene therapy is a very new and up and coming technological medical procedure, but there is certain gene therapies that are becoming new and experimental, where scientists and doctors are replacing the defective gene. So the mutated gene is being replaced with a copy of a healthy gene in hopes that it would divide and it would be able to create new healthy cells. Again, this is experimental and it's more advanced for certain disorders than others. But just to know the difference between the two, somatic cell gene therapy is only going to alter the DNA in your body cells, which are the ones that cannot be passed down to the next generation. And the germ cell gene therapy is an attempt to alter the egg or the sperm, the DNA in the egg or the sperm, which can affect the future, the future generations of being able to not inherit a really harmful mutation.